All right, well, welcome everyone. We'll just go ahead and do some of the introduction comments as we slowly have some additional people joining us today. I guess this is the second edition of Agricultural Land Management Quarterly for 2023. I think this marks maybe our fourth year of doing this webinar. So if you enjoy this, hopefully you continue to join us into the future. Today's webinar, I know with it being May, depending on where you're at in Nebraska, may be a very busy time or maybe slowed down a little bit if there was a little rain that came over the last week or so. But nonetheless, we'll be covering a variety of topics. And I'll go ahead and get moved over here. First thing I wanted to point out, you can find additional information on this program if you go to cap.unl/land management. That's where we usually place any upcoming meetings that we have scheduled, which we intend to get some scheduled here for this upcoming mid to late summertime period. I am Jim Jansen, and my contact information is on the left-hand side here. And if you want to find the most up-to-date real estate information on land values, cash rental rates, or things of that nature, be sure to take a look at cap.unl.edu/real estate. The second thing that I forgot to mention on our last call, and maybe Allan didn't mention on our last call, Allan Vyhnalek retired in early April. And with his retirement, he maintains emeritus status, which he's loosely associated with the university now with some of the retirement benefits that go with it. I was able to have him make a recording on his section of the slides today, and I think he'll talk in his clip. He's actually on a short vacation this week, but he'll continue to help us out, hopefully here for the next couple of sessions until we can find an appropriate replacement for him. If you try to send him an email or a call, he won't no longer respond, but you can find his resources. And I am able to answer any of the questions he could as well. You check out cap.unl.edu/succession. Second thing, today's webinar is being sponsored by People's Company, Nick Smith and Eric Greger out of the Omaha office. And they cover the greater state of Nebraska, but they can provide anything when it comes to farm brokerage services, farm and ranch brokerage, in addition to professional management. And I believe they also have an appraiser in their office if you're someone that needs that. Would greatly help that. Appreciate their financial support when it comes to these webinars and their assistance with helping out monetarily. So be sure to reach out to them, both very nice people, and we appreciate their support. So a short outline for today. First thing we're going to present on is the current trends in 2023 cash rental rates in Nebraska. What is some of the changes in commodity prices mean, and how do we account for that in cash rents? Allan Vyhnalek, his section will be on, once again, on communication. A lot of things happening, and once again this year, and the decisions related to that. And Allan's overall efforts he had here at the university, he talked a lot about decision making, just not on the short term, but also the long term and what that means for agricultural land. And we had some submitted questions. We'll go ahead and take a look at those at the end of our webinar today. And I've been told if you have questions as we're going along, please type them into the Q&A, the question and answer section, and I will try to address those as we're going along or towards the end of the talk when we get through with these. And once again, Allan will be joining us via recording, but I can take any questions related to his information being covered today. Okay, so first thing, we're going to be taking a look at the preliminary estimates on land values as well as cash rental rates that were published in the middle of March. And for those of you that are joining us for the first time, and for review for those that have continuously joined us, our annual survey of land industry professionals, so these are people that work in the land industry that have firsthand knowledge on the current events related to the transactions, whether for farm sales, farm purchases, maybe more importantly, if you're on our call today, cash rental rates. All of that information is published at the website listed below at cap.unl.edu/real estate. The preliminary results are usually published around March 15th, usually that Wednesday of I think it's about the second week in March. And then the full report is actually published in June. The full report has all the preliminary estimates information in addition to the final report. The final report has things like what percent of land in Nebraska is being sold via contract for deed or a cash sale or a mortgage. Once again, if you can either take a look at this link that our slides from today will be posted online. So either take a look at the cop.unl.edu/real estate website, or call your local county extension office. Many of the office managers across Nebraska have information pertaining to the preliminary or final report. Maybe they can run you off a copy, or maybe even throw a letter in the mail with that. So a little bit on cash rental rates across Nebraska. Now, the preliminary estimates, what you'll see is if you take a deeper look into our report, we estimated the market value of land increased about 14% year over year. Over the last 2 years, the market value of land has roughly increased around 30% over the last 2 years in Nebraska. Now, with that, we have a breakout here on current cash rental rates, and I'm going to step through dry land, irrigated, and grazing land, and make comments as we're going along. So for the 2023 season, the 2023 cash rental rates, and Ryan Evans slipped it in there. The link, you can also find our real estate information. But the cash rental rates related to dryland, cropland in 2023 are published here. You see it generally speaking across Nebraska, they are steady to slightly higher. Always keep in mind when you look at the percent change, 10% on 37 is a lot different than say 5% on 200 or 9% on 265. So it really depends where you're at in the state. What influences cash rental rates when it comes to cropland? Quality of the land. Does it have any ditches, terraces, things of that nature, cutting the field up that make it harder to farm around? Quality of the soil, is it a sand, is it a loam, is it a clay? Market competitiveness of the area. And even inside these regions of Nebraska, when you move from the southeast corner of Nebraska to the northwest corner, rainfall every 25 miles you move northwest in this state drops about 1 inch per 25 miles. So we go from southeast Nebraska, you're talking 32 to 34 inches a year, all the way up to extreme northwest Nebraska, you're talking 12 to 14 inches. So it depends greatly on where you're at in the state. Okay. In addition to what we had on the prior slide, we had the average. We also have what is called HAL. HAL stands for the average of the high grade, average of the low grade, and the overall average. And what you'll notice on there is that the high grade and low grade should really be called the upper third average and the lower third average. The survey participants, we don't specify that to be a high grade or a low grade, you have to have a certain yield or rainfall. We just ask them, what do you estimate the upper third of cash rent is in an area? What do you estimate the lower third of cash rent is in an area? So that's how we see the breakdown right here on cash rental rates for 2023. And once again, think about all those factors, all the market forces that are influencing land values and cash rental rates when we negotiate cash rents. Okay, let me go back for a slide there. In addition to the average for dryland cropland, we also have the average for center pivot irrigated cropland. And if you find the report, we also have the average for what we call the gravity or flood irrigated rate. Breakdown that we see on this table, we have a fairly good range on the cash rental rates across Nebraska. Cash rental rates assume that the landlord owns the entire irrigation system. So commonly on an irrigated, center pivot irrigated system, we're talking the pivot, the pump, and the power unit. As part of the final report this year, we'll actually be taking a look at how do you adjust the irrigated cash rental rates if the tenant is providing one of these components. Well, you'd probably discount that rate to account for the fact, okay, if the tenant provides the pivot, for example, that's an expense that the landowner doesn't have to carry insurance on or maintain if another party owns it besides themselves. The breakdown that we have here on cash rental rates for 2023 gives us a pretty good range across the state once again. Well into the 300s on the eastern part of Nebraska. Western 2/3, you're talking more so in the 200s or something in that range, maybe even to the mid 300s in the central part. The thing I want to point out when we talk about cash rental rates, and hopefully that people are getting favorable rainfall this spring and upcoming summer. If you're in an area of the state where cash rental rates, you're negotiating a cash rental rate for center pivot irrigated cropland, I would encourage you to account for the fact that if you're in an area where there's a shortfall in groundwater, some of the areas it varies depending on the year the well was drilled. Some of the NRDs set policies in the preceding year before this current growing year that dictate how much water use you can have. Please adhere to those standards, whatever they are for your area. Just be aware that the cash rental rates we have reported here, I would assume traditionally account for a full allocation or allocation fairly close to the full allocation. If you're in an area where you're cut back on the water, especially if it's a dry year, once again, be sure to negotiate that. How do we adjust that? How do we account for that in the cash rent? I would probably advocate if you're in an area of the state where it's dry, plus there's a reduction in water availability, that would probably be a case or a situation where you might negotiate a slightly lower cash rent or a cash rent that might have the ability to flex down slightly to account for probably a shortfall in yield or your desired yield related to a crop. Now, I'll be highlighting there are two different cash rental rates related to grazing land. One of those are for grazing land on a per acre basis, and that information can be found in the Farm Real Estate Report or the preliminary estimates for the state of Nebraska, where we give a breakdown once again of the high quality or high grade, high third average or high grade overall average, and then the low grade or the low third average. Now, with the breakdown that we have on this slide right here, I would like to highlight the cow-calf pair. I felt that this rate might be a little bit more common based on the call volume, but once again, the per acre is out there as well. What we tend to see in 2023 is cash rental rates tended to be fairly steady to maybe even slightly higher in certain areas. What influences the cash rental rates when it comes to grazing land? Well, some of the key things. Quality of the property. Once again, do you have a nice field? Maybe it's too wet to farm, but it makes excellent hay or grazing land. Who's taking care of the fences? Is it the landlord or the tenant? Well, depending on who it is, might influence that. I do feel that major upgrades to the fence, especially the materials, are a landowner expensive, because if the tenant vacates the property, probably not going to go out and take out a permanent barbed wire fence. In addition to that, we also have availability of water. This is another critical thing to be thinking about in the event we have a drought. If you have a natural stream and man-made dam, whatever, it's going dry this year. If the water quality is of a state that is not safe for livestock to drink, especially under extreme heat, how do you account for that in the lease? If a landlord is making guarantees as part of the lease, you need to make sure both parties understand what their responsibilities and obligations are if something would happen to that water resource or whatever the case is. Control of noxious weeds, trees, brush, anything that's unwanted. And I'm not talking just about having some shade trees. Shade trees on grazing land is fine. Noxious weeds might be things like cedar trees or types of brush related to that just have the ability to multiply. Well, if you have a property that has issues, that would be a good case where if you have a new tenant out there that's willing to help maintain those, maybe we discount the cash rent to account for the fact of this, what Allan Vyhnalek always called it, the sweat equity. Maybe we discount out that cash rent to try and incentivize that other individual to help maintain the property. And if you have 80 acres, 160 or whatever the number is, can we subdivide that property? We're thinking of it in a third. Can we subdivide that property in a way that you can work on the worst area first, and then you kind of step back, and as time goes on, maybe we discount the ground, discount the cash rental rate on the ground until we get those issues corrected. Weeds, brush, trees, fences, water resource, all these things can be negotiable. I would just make the comment, if you want a tenant to take care of some of these, are they starting with a good asset right away? Because if they're starting with an asset that faces a lot of challenges, it's harder to get someone to maintain those. And that's why we can try to financially incentivize someone by maybe discounting the cash rent or cost reimbursement or something to that effect. Okay. All right, so switching gears here, the first part we were talking about was mainly on the topic of cash rental rates. I want to take a look at some ideas on what are the major things that are influencing cash rents, and how do we adjust those cash rents to account for that? I'll give some basic flex lease ideas for those of you joining us today. So first thing, we have the state of Nebraska rate, or excuse me, we have the United States. And I went back and looked at this slide from a year ago. When it comes to the Drought Monitor, we like to see a map that has less red and orange and yellow on it. We like to just see a plain map, because that means we're getting adequate moisture. Now, the greater western half of the United States, while I think they're still recovering from the drought, it appears that things are in a much better state than they were a year ago. A year ago, the entire western half of the U.S. appeared in this shades of red and orange and yellow colors. Yes, there are still some very dry areas, but at the same time, things are looking better. Now, a little bit more focused on Nebraska, unfortunately, still got that ugly red color. We don't like that exceptional drought. We don't like drought in general. It's one thing to be a little bit dry, but I would say it's safe to say, except for a little southeast pocket in the state, the entire state of Nebraska has currently some degree of drought occurring on it. And this map was from late last week. And hopefully with the rainfall that we're getting, at least in my home country up here in the northeast corner of the state, maybe some of the severe drought will be backing down just a little bit more. But just be aware, that is a challenge we're facing. You might see a lot of things in the news about the higher corn and livestock prices, but you still need to have rain. And that's the critical thing in our state. And yes, we have irrigation, and that irrigation is not a complete substitution for still having rainfall across Nebraska. Zooming in a little bit closer here on the state of Nebraska, you can see there's kind of an unusual formation when it comes to the drought. It almost makes an extreme drought, almost makes somewhat of a U-shaped deal here with areas such as Wayne, I believe parts of Madison. If I'm not mistaken, I think even Platte County might be in on that. But there's some exceptional drought there. And I'm hopefully that this will at least change to a little bit lighter shade of red if this area has been getting rain. Just depends where you're at. I've heard reports in the western part of the state as well as additional rainfall coming in. All right, and just remember, this is found on the National Drought Mitigation Center website. It's a free resource from the University of Nebraska. If you just type in something like Drought Monitor Map or Drought Map United States, you can usually find it on any search engine fairly easy. But nonetheless, with this exceptional drought, or extreme drought, or whatever the case is, how do we account for that when it comes to grazing land or hayland or cropland? Well, you might consider a flexible lease arrangement. And the basic idea behind a flexible lease, and I know we've done seminars on this topic and you can spend almost an hour and a half talking on it. Basic idea behind a flexible cash lease is based on the actual performance of something. Say the crop yield, the pasture. When we say the pasture performance, you might be thinking of how many days can the cattle actually stay out there, or with respect to livestock, maybe the livestock price. And just because you have rain doesn't mean you have good livestock prices. When things are better than we'd expect, we're going to pay more. And excuse me, when I say things, when prices, yields, whatever, are lower than expected, you're going to pay less in cash rent inside a certain range. Okay. All right, so here we have our first example. Now I prepared this back in April when I had a little bit more time than I do here in May, but the general idea carries forward. So let's say we're going to do a flexible cash lease where we have two occurrences where we're flexing the lease on the actual price. of the crop, not the yield, but the actual price. And from crop insurance, there are different places where you can get the prices for flex leases. But from crop insurance, the flex lease price, or the base time planting time price guarantee, I believe, was about $5.91 a bushel. Now, two different things could happen. Let's say prices trend up about 45 cents a bushel. In this case, when you work through the example, you take the base cash rental rate and you multiply it by the change from going from 591 to 6, or going to 663 from 591. We're going to add on about 7.6% in cash rent. So 7.6% of 220 is about $17. You can take 220 plus 17. That gives us 237 an acre. Now, the flip side of this coin is, okay, if same example, but let's say prices actually trended down 45 cents a bushel. Well, under this case, we're going to discount the cash rent in proportion to the change we had on the lease with respect to the price. And under this case, we're going to let the cash rent drop to about 203. The critical thing to note here is you got to work within a range. If prices drop down to $2 a bushel, I'm not implying that cash rent should only be like $80 an acre or something, $100 an acre. Make a range. Anytime you do a flex, you need to have a range inside what you're working in. Maybe the maximum cash rent is 250. Maybe the minimum cash rent is 190. We call that our floor and our ceiling when it comes to the prices. Now work through two more examples here, and then we'll go ahead and have Allan get his materials up here, the recording playing. Another example we have for our friends that are in the grazing land industry. Let's say in this, I just picked some easy numbers to work with, and I do know feeder cattle futures prices might be a little bit higher than this, but nonetheless, let's say around calving, when you were working with your stock house calving this spring, maybe you looked at the futures markets and you've seen, okay, landlord wants $300 a pair. And we anticipate that feeder calf price in the fall, even if we don't necessarily sell them, I think they're going to be worth about $210 a hundredweight. Now we actually get to this fall, and for whatever reason, maybe there's a disruption in trade or something, prices are lower than we had hoped for. Under that case, when we look through the percent change between 210 down to 195, or 195 minus 210 divided by $210.37. This is a case where we let the price flex down. And when we let the price, or when the prices flex down, we're going to let our cash rent be discounted in proportion to that. Oops. And our next example here, once again, we expect to pay about $300 a pair, and feeder cattle futures prices actually ended up higher. Instead of being 210, they're about 225. And if you work through the math, once again, this is a case where we're actually going to increase the cash rented by about 7%. Why? Because we got a fairly good jump in the feeder cattle futures price. This is once again where you take 7% of the base, 300 times 7% is $21. 300 plus $21 is $321. Okay. All right, I'm going to go ahead and hold the questions till the end. We're going to have Allan's recording play, and then if you ask me a question, I will go back in the slides and answer those. Just make sure we have enough time today. All right, with that, Ryan Evans is going to go ahead and get us a short video clip played here. I didn't drop off. We're just going to have Allan's recording and start play. So go ahead, Ryan.
Well, hi, Allan Vyhnalek here with the University of Nebraska. While I'm still working, by the time you see this, I will have retired and I'll be on one of my first trips as a retiree of the university. So I hope what I say here makes sense. And if you have any questions, make sure you ask Jim. He'll be very qualified to handle them. We'll talk about some things happening for the 23 season. And I think the main thing is we have to make sure we're communicating well, because we're going into this summer really dry, as least at the time of this recording, for southeast and south central and southwest Nebraska, really dry. I understand the northeast part of the states has some rain and moisture, so snow. The northwest panhandle and northwest have had some decent snow, but boy, in southeast it's just a rough go. And in some places there's only like 2 or 3 inches of soil moisture and it's dry for 2 feet below that. So make sure that we are telling the landlords what's going on. And as you go through the growing season, then make sure you're reporting weed pressure, insect or disease pressure, and give them also other pertinent issues related to raising that crop. Things like what's happening with prices, the economy, expenses, what happened with fertilizer. I think fertilizer's backed off a little bit, but at the time of this recording, fuel's heading back up, and repairs are kind of out of sight. And actually, the weird thing is, getting parts is getting to be a bit of an issue too. So just make sure we got everything kind of taken care of that way. And communication is important even for cash leases. The landlord should hear from the tenant more than just when it's time to renegotiate next year's lease. They should be able to hear from them more often than that. So be sure you're communicating about these things and make sure that the landlord knows what's going on. The landlords will report to me that the main thing that they are concerned about is they don't know how to set the lease for the next year because they know nothing about what happened this year. So let's fill them in. Let's give them some information. Don't give them just the bad information. Give them some good information too. And both the good and the bad. Tell them what's actually going on out there. And I think if you increase communication, I think the negotiation for the next year's lease will go easier no matter how you set that up. And we need to communicate effectively on what's happening. And again, good communications, it depends on how well you listen to what their thoughts are. Seek first to understand before you can be understood. Ask clarifying questions. You don't ask to understand what someone says, or you don't necessarily agree with someone says. Don't attack them. Don't ignore them. Just say what causes you to say that. Why do you think that way? What information do you have to make you say that? And so just also understand that, you know, the economy and the way everything's kind of set up right now is way different than it has been traditionally because of first the pandemic. And then we kind of get out of that, and then we have the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and that's just changing how the world works and changes how our supply-demand changes, everything. So just know that it's an interesting time, and I think some flexibility is needed to make sure this works properly. For the landlords, they need to think about communication too, and they need to look around and think about what do they really want to have happen with their land. I think that our job as landlords, and I'm a landlord too, is to communicate what we want to have happen. What's our goal for the farm? What's our goal for that range? What's the goal for what happens in the future? And I think we also need to express our thoughts on what should happen with weed control or other management things, or how do you want the fertilizer handled, those kind of things. And even for cash leases, we have to be really careful about that and make sure we share that information. Look, our job is to have that ground in better shape for the next generation. And I think that that's more important than just capturing the top cash rent. And so I can't implore that upon people enough. We have to do the right thing for the soil and to keep the soil in good shape to raise crops for the future. Not worry about what the cash rent is this year. Now, do we need to adjust our crop share leases, or do we need to adjust leases because of what's happening with price and expenses and yields and dryness and all this other thing that's going on? So crop shares, typically you don't even have to have the conversation because the risk is shared between landlords and tenants. And so because the risk is shared, then the income or expenses are shared and the net income will be shared. So that's a done deal. It's all taken care of itself. If you set the flexible lease up properly, that doesn't have to be adjusted because the flexible lease should flex up and down in a way that allows for some of the risks to be shared. And I think that'll adjust itself. So the question becomes, what do we do with cash leases? How do we adjust those? If there's a term already set in place and we're paying X amount for cash leasing, and that's not going to be adjusted or amended, then it's kind of a done deal. But in some cases, I've heard of a farmer that paid a bonus for cash lease because the prices went higher than what he did, how he set his budget at the beginning of the year. And so he shared some of that extra profit with the tenant, with the landlord. The tenant paid the bonus rent. And he didn't have to. It was not in the lease, but man, what what a cool thing that was for the landlord, number one. And number two, how much goodwill, how much better does the landlord feel about keeping that tenant on the farm? It should be very good. It has to buy all the goodwill in the world because the tenant was trying to do the right thing. So depends on the terms of the lease if the cash leases are adjusted. And remember, we have motivation of how low or how high commodity prices go. So what I'm trying to say by having that point is just simply this. Know that when commodity prices are going down, that favors the landlord because the cash lease will kind of stay right here, right? When commodity prices are going up, that's going to favor the tenant because the cash lease will be set on this level. So each year you could try and play that game, but I'm just trying to say over a number of years that's going to even itself out. Don't get too excited about what happens with prices unless until you get ready to adjust to next year's lease. So I think that if you want to adjust a cash lease, you can, but just know that it'll be a joint decision between the landlord and the tenant. Certainly, the landlord and the tenant do not have to adjust. If it's set, it's set, and that's what you pay. But if they mutually agree that we want to try and adjust to cash rent because of what's happening with prices, then let's look at the gross crop revenue per acre compared to the actual cash rental rate and see how that all works out. And here's the example I want to give you. So we've got center pivot irrigated cash rent at $350 an acre. We expect 240 bushels of corn per acre. I don't know if APHs are quite that high, but people raise 240 bushel corn fairly regularly in good irrigated ground, and a price of $5.56 a bushel for this fall. The gross revenue then is 240 times 556 or $1,334 per acre. It's a simple calculation, price times yield. And then the rent is 26% of the gross revenue. So, that's done by just taking the rent, $350 per acre, and dividing that into the $1,334, the gross revenue per acre, and it's 26%. The range, in my view, should be somewhere around 25 to 35%. It's lower west, higher east in Nebraska, and it's also a lower percent of corn, 25 to 28, 29%, higher for soybeans, 30 to 35% of soybeans. So does this work? Yeah, it works. And so do you have to adjust this rent? Not necessarily, unless you absolutely think that that's right. But if you're looking at that example, $350 an acre is an equitable rent because you're falling within that range. Let's look at a dryland, grain-fed soybean example. Rent on that ground, let's say maybe it's eastern Nebraska, southeast Nebraska, around $200 an acre. Dryland APH, 40 bushels an acre. That'd be what you'd expect for the yield. Price for small fall beans is $12.70 a bushel. That's pretty much right on with where we're thinking right now. What's happening to at least as of this recording, and so that 45 times the gross income then was 45 bushels an acre, and 1270 bushels, $571 an acre income, and 571 divided by the 200 divided by the 571 is 35% of the gross revenue going for paying rent. So the typical range, 25 to 35%. Again, I said soybean percentage is higher, and so you're at the top of the level there. $200 an acre is a very correct amount of rent for this field based on that rent and these prices and that yield. And so you can do some adjustment here, and you can get these slides and from Jim and do some calculations on your own to see if you need to adjust cash rent based on something like this. To me, this makes some sense how we're going to make this all work out going forward. Pasture leases. So even today, as I get ready for this program, and recording it a couple of days before I retire, I just got a call from central Nebraska where they're worried about the drought for the summer, and that there's hardly any grass last year, and there's been very little rain or snow that stuck this over winter. So they're trying to figure out how they're going to handle the pasture for this year. The main thing I told that person that called me is the nice thing that you're doing here, the right thing that you're doing here is having a conversation before the pasture lease even starts. Make sure you can cover what's going to happen with fire, drought, or hail. We don't know. And so let's make sure that we're clear about what the stocking expectations are for stocking rates. Landlords need to be sure about how they would prefer that we control fertilization, those things to be taken care of. And tenants need to report conditions to that landlord, or tell them, hey, you got trees there, you got to get taken care of, any of those things, because those are landlord responsibilities. So just make sure you have all the right procedures in place, and have the conversations about fire, drought, and hail, and how that lease is going to be adjusted before you start. And if you end up going 3 months instead of 5, do you adjust the lease back by 60%? Those kind of conversations should be going on. And everybody needs to be considering, especially the tenants need to be considering the past arranged forage insurance, and hopefully they've already signed up for that. My last thing to talk about is, please understand that a written lease is necessary in any of these cases. To do any of these adjustments, please have a written lease. It's not your grandpa's farm anymore. Grandpas and grandmas, even my generation, said, our word is our bond and a handshake means something, so therefore we don't have to have a written lease. But we're not doing a written lease for us. We're doing a written lease in case one of us isn't around. I think the reason we do written leases is because, quite honestly, we forget some of the provisions or some of the little nuances over the years. If we had that written down, we wouldn't have that problem. So make sure that you get leases in writing, use some kind of a cash lease form, and you can use all of it, or you can take parts out that you don't need. And you get those, we're filling the blank things at aglease101.org. Jim may talk about this again when he gets back on here in a minute, but this is what that website looks like. Hang on right there. And if you click in the top there where it says document library, then you get these forms, you can pull up that cash farm lease, and that farm that's on the right-hand side, top link. And then you get something like this. And actually that's a fillable PDF. You just fill it out on your computer and you're ready to go. Having a written lease is really important. Please understand that if you have a handshake or verbal agreement, then you better understand that you should get that gone and get a written lease in place. Handshake or verbal agreements need to be terminated by September 1st for the following year for farm ground. So what I'm trying to say is your current lease in place as of May 23 started on March 1st for handshake or verbal agreements and goes till February 29th of 2024 because it's a leap year. And then the new lease starts on March 1st. To start to give proper notice on that March 1st start for the 24 lease, you have to give termination by before the 1st of September. So understand that and make sure you have that correct termination in place, and it's 6 months ahead of time on handshake agreements. If you have a written lease, then you follow what the written lease says. Please have a termination notice in the written lease. Just follow that and you're in good shape. But if you don't have one, then you need to follow this thing set up by the Nebraska Supreme Court that says you have to give 6 month notice on farm ground. So get a written lease, it's important. And I think with that, I'm finished up, and we'll turn it back to Jim right now. Thanks for listening. I've appreciated being able to participate today, even virtually, as I'm on a short little trip. So thanks for hanging in, and we'll talk soon. Appreciate it.
Hey, Jim, you're muted. Thanks.
All right, so that was actually a recording of Allan, and I guess that was his last presentation. Hopefully we can get him to help us out maybe a few more times briefly this year before we hopefully get another replacement for him or someone in this area of the state. If you do not have a lease in writing, please get one in writing. Doesn't matter your age, having something as writing is far more important than a verbal handshake lease, because you just never know what's going to happen. And if you don't want to go to an attorney to get a lease form, please take a look at aglease101.org. Okay, with that, we'll go ahead and we're going to get into some questions that were actually submitted. I actually had a few minutes. It was kind of nice having a little bit of a break and have Allan talk. There are several questions that came up, and I'll be sure to highlight those as we're going along here, and we'll get those answered before we're done today. So question 1, how should I include more conservation provisions in a grazing land lease? Things maybe such as a rotational grazing or cross fencing or different methods of weed control. Well, the first thing is, and I think Allan helped write this slide before he retired, was you have to communicate your intentions. And if you're a landlord or a tenant that wants to do something a certain way or wants something done a certain way, first thing is you have to communicate on the topic. Are you compatible with the other party? Are you two on the same page about these approaches? One area where I continually see conflict is when you have one person that wants one thing and one wants another. They start butting heads always on that. If that's the case, you got to make sure you have someone that believes in or has an understanding or experience doing rotational grazing or whatever you want to do. And on the topic of cross fencing, if you're going to have to install quarter-mile more fence to do sub paddocks or whatever the situation is, who's going to pay for that? Maybe there's some USDA cost share money. I think in the past there maybe has been different programs to helpfully kind of cover the cost or a portion of it. And when it comes to weed control, what are you talking about? Are you talking about chopping versus spraying, or spraying instead of chopping, or whatever the issue is? Just make sure you communicate and both parties understand exactly what they're getting themselves into. There's another question we had right here. Let's say you have a lease set up, and as part of the lease, maybe you have this individual pay a couple times during the year. It's not uncommon to see a portion of the cash rent paid when the lease is signed, another portion sometimes in the summer, and then the final balance in the fall, or sometimes we see it in the spring and then in the fall around harvest or when the cattle are removed. In any case, what happens if the one party is not paying the other party the amount of money when it's supposed to be paid? Does the lease continue until the termination date? How does it work? Well, the first thing is what's in the lease. Some leases have things like late payment provisions. Maybe they can do a late payment, but you have to add on an interest penalty, for example. Depending on what state you're in, if you're joining us from a state outside of Nebraska, there are certain things that specify exactly what happens with the late payment. If you can place a thing such as an eviction on the tenant, or a lien on the growing crop or the livestock present at the site, there are different things that can be done. But if you go down that route, that usually gets into the area where you have to seek legal counsel, legal representation, to get the proper, I believe, civil complaint or suing someone to get those things moving. So that's beyond the scope of what Allan and I are trained in. Just know, one, what's in the lease, and two, if you don't have that in the lease, make sure you have something in the lease so everyone understands. And if you're in this situation, I would say this is probably a situation where you buy an hour of an attorney's time, talk over your situation, and see what can be done, and make the judgment call based on that. And moving forward into the future, if that trust has been lost, unless there was something exceptional that happened with that person, an example, if they got in an accident and they didn't have their personal affairs in order for 6 months, maybe that's the time to be looking for a new landlord or a new tenant. So once again, I would refer you to legal counsel. And as we're going along here, there's just a couple slides I wanted to hit to wrap up. But you please submit questions. I have 3 of them in the chat pane right now. I'm going to hit them next. Just want to thank People's Company once again. The sponsorship of this webinar helps with the online costs, but also conducting our annual land survey. So be sure to contact Nick or Eric if you have any questions in the land industry. There's been other great companies that have helped us out each quarter as we go along. And one other thing, and one of the questions, I'll actually start with the where, if you're willing to help us out financially with the cost of doing the annual land survey, so the actual survey when it comes to the printing and mailing and envelope stuffing and all that, please contact the NU Foundation, and you can go to go.unl.edu/landfund, and there's actually a deal on there. And there was a question that came in, who do you contact? Contact Barbara Sonderland. She's with the NU Foundation, and she can answer any questions if you have any questions pertaining to tax deductibility or whatever the questions are. But Barbara would be the point of contact, and it's go.unl.edu. And I will also type this in to the chat pane that if you'd like to contact Barbara, please take a look at what I just typed into the chat. Okay, so we got that question answered. So we had several questions come in. There was a question here with the application in Northeast Nebraska, and I suspect this might be applicable to other areas as well. But basically, the idea being there's been some record-setting land sales prices and also record-setting cash rental rates. One, how are people paying? In this example, they said in Northeast Nebraska, somebody paid $10,000 an acre for some dryland, cropland, and property doesn't cash flow. How are they doing these things? Well, one thing, this might be someone, there are some of these 1031 exchanges where they're selling land in a different area of the state or the United States, and they're turning around, they have to find another asset to put that money in if they don't want to pay capital gains. So we see some of that occurring. Other cases is if you own a fair amount of land, you maybe are cross-subsidizing that purchase with your other parcels of land you might own in an effort to try and grow your operation. I've heard many people talk about the 1980s where they mentioned these super cycles of prices went up, and then people started getting very aggressive in buying or renting, and then interest rates followed. That's something else that I do think will have a big impact on the farm real estate market eventually, is the cost to borrow money. 30-year ag land loan, I haven't looked this week, but I would suspect it's probably around 7 to 7.2%. It's not too terrible of an interest rate, but going back a couple of years ago, I think there was a period of time when you could get an interest rate with the effective interest rate on the land loan of less than, say, 4%, maybe 3.5 to 3.75 or something for 20 to 30 years. So there are things occurring. And that partially, hopefully, answers your question that was sent in. And on the topic of the ultra high cash rents, just know that the cash rents that we are reported, we have a process in place to filter out the extremes on either end, whether, you know, a grandmother to a grandson at an exceptional less than a quarter of the going rate or something, or some of these extreme things where we're paying. There, one case that was noted here as part of the second part of the question on cash rents exceeding 500 to 600 an acre. How are these cash flowing? I haven't figured that out. Unless you're in an area where you have to have the land to spread manure, or you intend to chop silage, for example, for like a dairy or feedlot, which when it comes to chopping silage, yes, you can truck silage a fair ways, but at the same time, it kind of comes down to one of those features that, you know, there's something to be said about distance. And if you're chopping silage, you're probably going to turn around and hauling manure on it again too. But yes, there has been some exceptional cash rental rates paid. I don't know if these rates actually make financial sense, but there has been some things, and we have our processes in place to try and screen these things out. And that's why Allan and I presented some different ideas that hopefully some of these have touched somebody on the call today to think of things a little bit differently. I know the price of corn I used for fall of 2024 is actually a little high. Cash corn prices, I would suspect, to be in the low to maybe at tops mid fives right now. It's not to say we can't have the market recover a little bit, but it appears prices are trending a little bit lower than they had been in the prior year. So with that, once again, if you got any questions, we'll hang on here for a minute or two. We had a very nice group that kind of all got going here eventually, and hopefully Allan's recording worked out. If you have any questions or insight, you can be sure to reach out to me. Oh, I forgot to mention this. For 2023, for August 21st, 2023, we're going to be talking about our special features section from the final report that's going to get published on how do you actually adjust irrigated cash rents if the tenant provides a pivot or the power unit, for example. And then our landlord-tenant communication, that verbal lease termination, what's that all include? What's that look like? And there's actually a bill in the state of Nebraska. We'll see if it gets passed or not. But they were talking about modifying some of those terms. To my knowledge, it hasn't passed yet. We'll see. I think the state legislature is starting to wrap down on their session. I think they have a lot of things at hand to get passed or debated yet. And then we'll have any of our upcoming landlord-tenant cash rent workshops and things of that nature. And be sure to keep an eye on your email if we have any meetings get announced for here for the summer. We are working on some dates. And if you'd like to reach out to Allan or myself, just give me a call or phone number. or email address. Once again, Allan is retired. We thanked him for his years of service here. And yeah. So with that, well, I'll stay on for a minute or two, but I think pretty well all the questions, and it looks like people are starting to drop off just slightly now. But once again, if you got any questions, type it into what's called the Q and Pay. It looks like two little talking bubbles or whatever you want to call them. You can type it into the Q&A, and we appreciate everyone for joining us today. It was a nice session, and hopefully if I can snag Allan maybe one or two more times before we get some new hires made, maybe we can get him to join us one more time in person online here. But with that, I'll just hang on for another minute and we'll see if we get any other comments.